Hi, my name is Kathleen, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Operations for the Army Historical Foundation and your host for Army Artifacts, a program for Foundation members that will demonstrate that Army history can be found everywhere. Today, my guest is Nalleli Guillen, who is the Associate Director of Curation and Exhibition in the Collections and Storytelling Division at Minnetrista Museum and Gardens in Muncie, Indiana. Today, she and I will be speaking about Edmund F. Ball and a wartime ID badge. Nalleli, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Can you start us off by telling us a little bit about Edmund F. Ball?
Yeah. Um, Edmund F. Ball was a second generation member of the Ball family here in Muncie, Indiana. Um, Muncie, like a lot of other sort of cities in the United States where you have a big family name, the Balls were the big name here in Muncie. So the Ball brothers moved here in the 1880s and began Ball Brothers Company, who were the manufacturers of the ball mason jar, which a lot of people still know today. Edmund was the son of one of those brothers. He was born in 1905, and he was one of those men about town who really, he was a leader in the community. He was vice president of Ball Brothers Company. He rose to become president of Ball Brothers Company. He was president of Ball Brothers Foundation, which is a philanthropic nonprofit that still exists today, that does a lot of good work here in East Central Indiana. He was a pilot. He was a big supporter of the arts and of the community in general. And during World War II, he was a soldier.
What can you tell us about Edmund's wartime experience?
So I was sort of surprised by it because I came into understanding a little bit more about him sort of from a side door. I'm an object specialist by trade or by training. So I actually came across this little guy in our collection. It's an ID badge. You can see him there in his uniform. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but um, he actually, later in life in the 1950s, he wrote an entire memoir about his time in the war. He had actually been enlisted into service in 1941, a little bit earlier than a lot of other folks. He was in the service before Pearl Harbor, in part because when he was in college, he had signed up for ROTC classes to be with friends, had gone through the entire process, had become a first lieutenant in the infantry, and then a few decades later got called up to serve. So he went in and he actually did spend a fair amount of time abroad. He spent 22 months um, abroad, a lot of that as a staff officer for General Mark Clark, who headed the Fifth Army. So he spent a lot of time in North Africa and as part of the land invasion of Italy. And that's really what he focuses on here. The book is called Staff Officer with the Fifth Army, Sicily, Salerno, and Enzino. So he was very contemplative about his time on the actual sort of combat front later in life. But this little dude actually relates a whole lot more to the end of his time in the Army once he was brought back to the United States. So as far as I can
You
tell, he
would
didn't
not think
necessarily,
that.
yeah, I know. He didn't necessarily
Would not
spend
think that.
a ton of time sort of like on the front lines, right? He was kind of an administrative assistant to a general, but he did actually, especially in Italy, I think, spend a lot of time um, on the ground, and that really had a big impact on his life.
Now, you mentioned earlier he was a trained pilot. Did he get to do any piloting during this time abroad or when he was a soldier?
So it's kind of interesting. He came back to the States in spring 1944. He was kind of his time abroad changed. They brought him back and they sort of restationed him. And at one point he was in Louisiana, I think, and did spend a little bit of time flying. It doesn't seem like he did much of it actually abroad, but he has a long history of interest in aviation. The Ball family actually helped found Muncie's first airport in 1932. Ed and his second wife, Virginia, were actually both very much flying enthusiasts. They were pilots, and sort of, he has other books that he has written or that he wrote during his lifetime that are something like rambling recollections of his time kind of in the sky. So it was a definite interest. I think he had it a little bit before the war, but it's something that actually followed him for much longer after his life, after the war as well.
There are any things that stick out from his staff officer book, like big
Goodness.
notes?
It's very he wrote it in the late 50s. So he published it like 56, 58, something like that. And it's very grandiose in some ways. As it would be, sort of thinking back 10, 15 years later. He does make a comment somewhere towards the end that that he was in the army to fight a war and not sit at a desk. And I think it gives you a lot of that sort of dissonance of experience, I think, that some people have, where you think that, you're in the army, it's fighting a war, you think it's all sort of frontline and, kind of danger and scary, but there's a lot of different kinds of tasks and responsibilities that go into the war effort as a whole. And I think a lot of his experience was that kind of administrative stuff, which I think he was happy to do during the war. But by the time he got sent home, and by the time he ended up at his last post in Michigan, I think he was a little bit over it, which he's pretty honest about in the memoir. It's pretty funny to read.
So you said that pin that you held up is from when he came back from overseas. So what is that pin for?
So let me see if I can. Let me share this screen real quick. And you can see this image a little bit better than me holding up this little dude in my hand.
Still, seeing the little dude is pretty awesome.
Okay. Does it fill the screen? Can you still see my
It
entire
does.
screen?
Yes, it's
Okay.
great.
So he's a little bit bigger there. You can see in my hand that it's pretty small. But Ed's last sort of major assignment was he was in 1944 transferred to Dearborn, Michigan. When he came back, he made a note in his memoir that a notation of business experience popped up one day on his NGO card. And because of that, he was sent for additional training on procurement contracts and dispersal of surplus property, and actually worked for maybe 3 or 4 months as a plant clearance officer assigned to Ford. What I really like about the pin is all the little details that you really see around his face there that really give you a little sneak peek as to what it was actually happening at Ford during the war. So you can see their logo at the top, but next to it they have Air Corps, and then that little plane that's engraved on the bottom. Let me see if I can go one more. Edmund ended up out at Dearborn in 1944. So Ford had already been up and running for several years by this point. But towards the beginning of the War Department selected Ford to mass produce warplanes. They produced B-24 bombers at a 3.5 million square foot facility that they built custom just outside Detroit for this purpose. And it was a massive undertaking, and one that they really relied on their experience with assembly line manufacturing that they had perfected with the Model T to make happen. But by the time Mr. Ball ended up out there in 1940 it was a well-oiled machine. Statistics show that Ford could pump out one of these massive planes in just over an hour, something like 63 minutes, and that by the end of the war, by the time the last plane went off the line in June 1945, they had created over 6,800 at this facility alone.
What did Edmund do specifically at Ford?
So I wish I could actually give you a really detailed answer, considering that his memoir is something like 200 plus pages. His time at Ford constitutes like 2 pages in the very epilogue of the book. So it's really, I think, indicative in some ways of how kind of changed his focus was by the time he was back on domestic soil. From the little bit that I can really kind of understand, I think he was helping move materials around. So he was stationed there and working with Ford's resident representative on behalf of the Air Technical Service Command. So I think he was helping kind of, how would you say, kind of requisition materials and send them on to final locations and that sort of thing. But he really didn't do it too long. He was there by November 1944, and his resignation from the Army had been accepted by the beginning of February 1945. So it would have been a couple of months before he kind of said that he was good to go. And I from what I have come to understand from reading through the memoir, it's not to say that the assignment wasn't one that he wouldn't have found interesting. Like I said, he's got all of that interest in aviation that I think would have brought his kept his attention. But it really seems like he had a very strong kind of attachment to what was going on in Muncie at the time and really wanting to be home. And he says outright at one point, he says, as long as I'm going to be connected with business anyway, I thought I could make a better contribution by working on my own. If he was going to be put back into his businessman hat, he wanted to be able to do it from his own town with his own company, where a lot was happening during the war as well. So he, as much as I love the little pen, he kind of pieced out from there pretty quick because he was pretty much ready to take on the next chapter in that particular part of his sort of war life as a civilian.
So since we're talking about Ford and his own company, what was going on at the Ball Company during the war?
So let me see if I can share this picture with you. Ball Brothers Company, today really best known as manufacturers of the ball mason jar. The company had been established here in Muncie by the 1880s, and really by the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, was one of the largest manufacturers in the world of canning jars, of these kind of, pack and seal glass containers. But that entire enterprise is actually one that was quite multifaceted because Ball did not just produce the glass jars. They actually produced all of the metal seals that went along the top. They had in-house kind of packaging, cardboard. They worked in metal and zinc and aluminum. And the metal trades that were actually part of the larger manufacturing process at Ball were turned over during the war for producing battery shells. So these pages that I'm sharing that you can see on the screen, these are pages from the Ball line, which was the Ball Company staff newsletter. And these are from during the war, and they're talking about the battery shell department and then where the shells went abroad. They really focused on manufacturing those during the whole of the war. And so the company says produced more than half of all the battery shells used by the U.S. Armed Forces and their allies during the war. So it was really like most companies that, either being told or doing so voluntarily, it was a kind of a gargantuan effort to turn over and start doing war work in their place. And I think Mr. Ball really had a little bit of a complex about the fact that, especially by the time he was back in the US, but still kind of commissioned in the Army, the fact that he was not home helping lead the company through a lot of these things. There's another quote from his autobiography that says, when I learned firsthand the incredibly tough job our people had been doing in keeping our plants operating as shorthanded as they were, bedeviled by regulations, shortages, restrictions, rationing, demands for this and demands for that, I almost felt like a shirker. So he was ready to come home and kind of help with that final push. And he did.
Then that leads into my next question. Did the company end up benefiting the town, helping the town during World War II? What was going on in Muncie at the time? Like, how did it all connect?
It did. Give me 1 second. Let me think about a good way to put this. So Muncie, really by World War II, it wasn't all that old of a town. Really, sort of Muncie as a sort of known entity really only dates back to the 1840s. The city itself was designated a city by the end of the Civil War. And it wasn't really until natural gas was discovered in this area in the 1870s that you really had a lot of manufacturing interest kind of descending on East Central Indiana. You know how in the 1800s you have coal in a lot of places that really kind of livens up manufacturing power. In East Central Indiana, it was natural gas. So there was a lot of glass manufacturers like Ball in this area. There was steel. There was a lot of automotive industry. A company called Warner Gear, Borg Warner, GM had a plant out this way. Chevrolet had a plant out this way where a lot of car parts were made. And I think like a lot of places in the United States before World War II, that was a little flaggy. Sort of the Great Depression had really kind of put a damper on a lot of that kind of industrial work. But the war really kind of put a jump start into manufacturing interests because there was so much need and demand. And there were, not just in Muncie, but in our larger area in Delaware County and in East Central Indiana, a lot of factories that turned over entirely to war work. I have a great example in they're my new favorite company that I've learned about in Muncie called Durham Manufacturing Company. They like Ball, they actually had kind of a similar trajectory. Durham was established probably around 1910, early, somewhere in there, and they produced modern matched bridge tables and chairs, outdoor furniture, and outdoor seating equipment. So the little kind of like folding table and chairs that you see on that screen, that's what Durham specialized in prior to World War II. When the war hit, Durham switched over and they started manufacturing 20 and 40 millimeter artillery shells. You can kind of see that in the sort of center bottom of that sort of central image. And they put a lot of really sort of focused attention and effort into that, to the point that in sort of spring 1942, Durham was awarded the first of their Navy E awards. The E awards were awarded to companies for excellence in the production of war materials. Very quickly, that award switched over from just Navy to the Army Navy E award. And Durham, over the course of the war, received probably 5 of them. So they were one of the most decorated manufacturers during the war in Indiana. And even just on the grand scale across the country, less than 5% of manufacturers that were producing war materials were awarded that award. So Durham is our little sort of wartime manufacturing star.
Is that what makes it one of your favorites?
I just love that they made bridge tables. It's one of the oddest little the photo that I have up is from our collection. We have some of their tables and chairs, and it's just such an innocuous little thing, you know. I feel like everyone's grandparents has one of these little like folding aluminum tables somewhere. And I always love kind of connecting what feels like an everyday item to a kind of a larger manufacturing story, kind of a business history, especially for a company like this one that really kind of stepped up big during the war and really kind of started doing something completely different, you know, to go from a bridge chair to artillery shells is a big change.
So let's jump back to Edmund. I mean, because we're talking about his pin, we talked about his company, the town. What happens to Edmund after the war? What's going on?
So he makes it home. He, sort of resigns his commission. He's back to civilian life by 1945. When he started the war, or when he started his service in the war, he left his position as vice president of Ball Brothers. We actually have this great little kind of like guest book, sort of, that was signed by lots of employees at Ball. But in advance of his leaving for the war, lots of people just did little signatures. One person sort of said something like, "Let the young guys kind of do the scary work, and you just come back to a safe." He was 38 when he left for the war. By the time he came back, he rose very quickly within the company. So by 1948, he had stepped in as president of Ball Brothers Company and held that position until 1956. After that, he spent a good amount of time both as chairman of the board for Ball Corp and as president of the foundation. And one thing that was really great about having him kind of in both of those seats of power was that he was really able to help encourage people towards larger community projects. So the fact that Minnetrista today exists at all is in many ways a big thank you to Edmund F. Ball. Our main building, we sit on the site of one of the Ball family homes that burned down in the 1960s. And it was just this big kind of empty spot that the family started wondering about at one point, what should we do with this land? It's just kind of open space. We should do something for the community here. And the idea came up from Minnetrista Cultural Center. And Edmund was really able to sort of move people along. We broke ground in 1988, and we're still here today, 35 years later. Serving the community. One other thing that a lot of people probably know Minnetrista for right now is also thanks to E.F. Ball, which is the Bob Ross experience. So here at Minnetrista, we opened an exhibit called the Bob Ross Experience in 2020. One of the other historic houses on our property was the site of the filming of The Joy of Painting in the 1980s. And the house was lent to WIPB, which was our local PBS affiliate, by E.F. Ball, in part because he was a major supporter of PBS, of Public Broadcasting Services, and of the NEH. And so the fact that we have PBS content and broadcasting today is a great EF thing, but people who come here just looking for the joy of painting can really attribute it to him as well. We have a great photo of EF and Bob in the collection from the early 1990s. We did the very first museum retrospective of Bob Ross's artwork here at Minnetrista. So he did a paint out with us here, and there's a lovely photo of the two of them together sort of working on a painting.
That's amazing.
It's, he was a very passionate and convincing gentleman, and he lived a long time. He passed away at 95 in the year 2000. So he had a long time after the war where he was really able to sort of focus his interests both via the company and via the nonprofit towards really enriching this area. And that's what really Minnetrista still today has our kind of focus set on. We help preserve and celebrate the arts, history, and industry of East Central Indiana. And we really do that in part because members of the Ball family, like EF, helped set that stage for us.
Is there any part of what happened in his later life that was influenced by what happened to him in the Army or during the war?
I wonder sometimes, this is a little bit more speculative on my part, just because I don't actually know. I haven't done this legwork yet, but he was out in Michigan sort of watching this well-oiled manufacturing machine with Ford. And he got back here, and really there was a big kind of, the only phrase I can think of is like a come to Jesus moment for the company, for the Ball Brothers company after the war, because there was a very different outlook for glass mason jars in the post-war period. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, you really have a very different sort of American family, a very different American kitchen, and not as many people were canning in that same way. So I think potentially in part because he was pivoting and thinking about the best ways to stay efficient and stay productive. He made a lot of changes kind of following through. We brought in packer jars. There was a bigger push on other kinds of materials that the company was producing. If you were to ever, the next time you drink a can of pop, like a Coke can, look on the side because you'll see the Ball Corp logo on there. Ball Corp actually does not produce glass anymore, but they do still produce aluminum cans. And they're everywhere
I'll
when
have
you see them. And they actually did eventually, in the 1960s, they made the decision to close down the glass plants here in Muncie because they were no longer operating efficiently for the company. And that was a big kind of scary moment for the town. I wouldn't necessarily say that it has something outright to do with that experience in the war, but I feel like it could not have not had some kind of impact. Sort of seeing a company that big operating at kind of that scale, it really makes you think about how you position yourself in the best way moving forward, because everyone had to pivot post-war. That was manufacturing, because you had to kind of find the new normal in a very changed landscape.
Does Minnetrista have anything else related to World War II or the Army?
We do. And I think when I first started sort of doing the sort of research and sort of background to prepare for our conversation today, I was going through a lot of stuff and thinking that I think we have so much stuff, particularly related to World War II here. I think because it was the most kind of recent major event in a lot of the lifetimes of the people that were here when we opened. So a lot of the older generations in 1988, they still had stuff that they had been holding on to from World War II. So we have, not just the ID badge, but for EF Ball in particular, we have uniforms, we have his, army trunk, we have letters he wrote to the family, we have notebooks of material. But from the larger community as well, we have dog tags, we have medals, we have uniforms, we have photos, we have a lot of ration cards from the community, like tens of dozens of, these kind of like, the ration stamp cards that just sort of stuck around. That I think it had such an impact on people on the home front, having to sort of figure out how to feed themselves in that really restrictive environment, that they just held on to them. We have a lot of sort of trophies of war, kind of German helmets and sort of Japanese such and such and that sort of thing. But it's World War II in particular. There's a lot of stuff. We have a little bit of Civil War stuff. We have some World War I stuff. But they're I feel like we've got a nice critical mass of World War II stuff in particular, that not just connected to the Ball family, but to the larger sort of community in our region.
Wow, so there's a lot for our foundation members if they happen to be in the area, a
100%.
lot for them to connect with.
100%.
I want to thank Nalleli for being my guest today. If you would like to learn more about Edmund F. Ball and Minnetrista, please visit their website at www.minnetrista, Minnetrista.net, and thank you for watching.